How did Islam spread to Western Africa? What are some features of pre-modern West African Islam? Define Marabou. Describe the experience of enslavement and the transatlantic crossing. Explain what we know and what we don't know about Muslims enslaved in America and why. Define Hafez. Before we begin today, I'd like to give you some content warning. We're going to be discussing the process of enslavement in this video, and thus, we're going to have to talk very openly about some very disturbing issues. This is going to be hard for many of us, and in fact, it shouldn't be easy to hear. But I would like to urge you to listen and consider these events so that we can discuss them together in class. This is not ancient history. Islam is always diverse, always. But after the Mongol conquests, and most especially after the start of European colonialism, the many paths of Islamic history scattered far and wide. And so if we want to track this monotheistic movement that arose out of the late antique Hijaz into the present, there's more than one path to take. Do we follow the road of Islam into China and then into Korea and Japan? Do we trace the movement of Islam into Indonesia and Malaysia? Do we stay put in the Middle East and North Africa and see how Islam continued to evolve in those places? Do we track the trail of Islam into Western Europe, or the Balkans, or Southeast Asia? Any of these roads can be followed, and each one would tell us something unique about the story of Islam's unfolding. Here, we're going to talk about the winding road that Islam took and continues to take to get to the Americas in general and the United States specifically. We're going to tell the tale of American Islam. But it's not that simple. Islam was in North America even before there was a United States. And so first, we need to travel back before the establishment of the US in 1776. The Muslims already living in the newborn United States? Where did they come from? Who were they? And the answer isn't a happy one. The Muslims in America were first, and overwhelmingly, in chains. With very few exceptions, Muslims were enslaved in the American South. These were the Muslims of West Africa and their immediate descendants. And so the story of American Islam, that is, the story of enslaved Muslims in the United States, takes us first to Western Central Africa, where America's first Muslims came from. We don't know exactly when the first Muslims came to Western Africa, but it was probably quite early. We do know that there were Muslims in Northern Africa as early as the Rashidun Caliphate in the 650s and 660s. But we can't say for sure when the caravan routes that crossed the Sahara put the Northern African Muslims in contact with West Africa. It might be as early as the 7th or 8th century, but we do know that by the 11th century, there were at least 2 Muslim rulers in West Africa. Wardabi in Takrur, modern Senegal, and Kosoy in Gao, modern Mali. It might even be that the term Malay, meaning someone from Mali, is derived from the word Muslim. Like the spread of Islam in India and Indonesia, Western African Islam spread slowly, without much direct force from the Arab and Amazi worlds of North Africa. Islam was never the majority religion of the whole region, but it was quite present. It still is. By the early colonial period, Muslims range from between 30 to 40% of the populations of Western Africans. And like Islam everywhere, West African Islam is distinct from other Islamic cultures elsewhere. Most notably, there is the impact of Sufism. While there's Sufism everywhere that there's Islam, in Western Africa, Sufi tariqa is grafted especially well onto the specifics of the local cultures. The indigenous religions of Western Africa, as well as Western African Christianities, already featured musical and incantational rituals, asceticism, fasting, and saintly holy people. It was therefore only a short jump to redirect those religious energies into Sufi dhikrs, Sufi brotherhoods, and Sufi ascetical practices. Unlike the northern coast of the continent, Western Africa's Arabization process was quite mild. Arabic would never become a major spoken language, but it would, however, become the language of learning, culture, and communication. The Niger-Congolese languages of West Africa weren't often written down before the modern period, like most of the world's languages. And so, when Muslims brought Arabic with them, it did as it often did. It became a literary language. So, a Muslim would speak a local language, such as Mande, Yoruba, Fula, Dogon, Ijo, Balanta, or many others. But when it comes to reading and writing, Arabic would be used. If you know anything about the history of Latin in Western Europe, a similar situation occurred there. Not only did knowing Arabic this way unlock the Quran, it brought commerce, education, science, and literature from the greater Islamic world into this one region, and it allowed the West African Muslims to respond with their own literatures in kind. Also, unlike many non-Islamic places in pre-modernity, it seems that Arabic literacy was taught to both boys and girls, as well as people across social classes throughout West Africa. And this access to the larger literary and scientific world via Arabic also encouraged many non-Muslim West Africans to learn Arabic too. And at the same time, the presence of Arabic also encouraged the creation of Ajami, that is, local languages written in the Arabic script or derivations of it. The presence of Islam, especially Sufi Islam and Arabic literacy, collided in the distinctive African institution of the Marabout, from the Arabic Marabat. The Marabout was at once a teacher, especially a teacher of Arabic or the Quran, and they were also a Sufi sheikh or something quite like one. Usually, but not always, the Marabout was a poor person who lived off of alms. Therefore, if you were a Muslim, you could access the Quran and other Islamic learning by paying a Marabout. So therefore, Islam would tend towards Sufism. And if you were a non-Muslim who wanted to learn Arabic for non-religious reasons, you could still pay the Marabout as a teacher, but you'd end up sitting at the foot of a spiritual master who would directly or indirectly help you learn a little bit about Islam. So West African Islam had a unique blend of Sufism and Arabic language education in the Marabouts, and therefore, this specific blend led the educated people, even non-Muslims, to lean towards Sufism. And to be a Muslim was to be in proximity to educated Sufis. The number of schools per capita in pre-modern West Africa was staggering, far exceeding the number of schools found in the European or Arab worlds at the same time. In fact, a number of West African rulers and Marabouts would set up their own educational systems in the Arab world, especially in Egypt. Thus, pilgrims on the route to go on Hajj would have a place to study and learn, like they did back home. Apparently, there was an assumption that the Egyptian Arab schools were not as high quality as the West African ones. Reconstructing the history of how West Africans, Muslim and non-Muslim, came to be held in bondage is both quite tricky and, in another sense, fearfully easy. On one side, the Europeans who were doing the kidnapping were keeping very careful records of how many people they picked up and where. Since these people, from the European point of view, were valuable cargo, they kept their numbers attentively. We have frighteningly exact information about how many people were kidnapped, when, and from what ports. But conversely, these people were actively dehumanized. The captors did not record names, ages, homelands, languages, or the religions of these people in their manifests. And since reading and writing was forbidden for nearly all enslaved people, and they didn't have access to paper and ink anyway, the records of the actual kidnappings and transport across the Atlantic by those who actually went through the process are scarce. And even the records that do survive to us, created by those who survived the horrors of enslavement, often skate around the details of how they came to the Americas. Not unlike military veterans who've seen a great deal of combat, deeply traumatized people often don't want to talk about it, even with each other. From the records that we do have, the typical case of enslavement would have worked something like this. Slavers of various kinds, all sorts of Europeans as well as indigenous Africans, understood that the trade of human labor was almost pure profit. So the enslavers would raid a settlement, such as a village or a town, and then parade the survivors out on a caravan by binding the people neck to neck with tree branches or rope, forcing them to walk in a single file and making it impossible for them to suddenly move forwards or backwards without hurting yourself or those in front of you. Then, the settlement left behind would be intentionally burnt down so as to prevent any would-be escapees from attempting to return back home again. Now, these enslaved West Africans would be marched slowly towards the sea, stopping along the way to be sold from trader to trader. Or they would also be paired up with other caravans. The captured people, more often than not, had no idea where they were being taken, and for that matter, neither did their captors. Since this process involved walking perhaps hundreds of miles with no proper food or water, and at the pace of the fastest walker, we can imagine that the mortality rate of children and the elderly must have been quite high. At the coast, the doorway to the Middle Passage, is where the historical record gets a little bit more precise. For those whose enslavers brought them to the ocean, they were crowded onto ships, again with little idea of where they were going. Chances are, few even knew they were being taken to sea before they were boarding the ships. Coupled with this was the complete ignorance of most Africans from the interior lands of European culture. Many seemed to think that they were simply going to be slaughtered when they reached whatever their destination was. In the holds of the ships, between 200 and 1,000 people were packed in. If anyone was still with immediate family members, they'd be separated. Before boarding, the kidnapped people were stripped of all clothing, had their heads shaved, and their backs were branded with a hot iron. The branding was to mark the owner in the Americas who had purchased them. The heads were shaved to prevent lice and other pests. The clothes were removed to prevent people from hanging themselves. The length of these trips could vary quite a bit, depending on where they were leaving from, conditions at sea, and where they were going. Voyages across the Middle Passage could last from 3 weeks to 6 months. On board, the rations were kept deliberately low, both as a way to cut costs and to keep the captured people weakened. The enslaved were usually only bathed once immediately before their arrival at port, when their buyers would see them, and so during the voyage, smell and disease were major issues. In many ships, the captives were not allowed to come up to the deck at all, or if they were, it would only be for the amusement of the sailors. Making the West Africans dance seemed to be quite typical, although this ran the risk of the hostages revolting, or, more commonly, throwing themselves overboard. While we can't track it with any precision, we must also imagine that rape and murder must have been standard occurrences. We can't say how many people died in the actual process of enslavement, the sieging, raiding, and burning of towns and villages, and then the slave caravans that followed. But what we do know quite a bit more about are the numbers aboard the boats. Between the rise of European colonialism in the 17th century and the end of the slave trade in the 19th century, some 13 million West Africans were taken captive aboard the slave ships. Of those, some 10 million arrived on the slave markets of the Americas, meaning that the mortality rate of the slave ships was on the order of 1 in 4 people. 3 million kidnapped people did not survive the passage. The leading cause of death was suicide. We really have no way of knowing for sure how many of these 10 million people who survived were Muslims. We can guess that the numbers were considerable and roughly paralleled the percent of Muslims in West Africa at the same time. So estimates vary from between 20 to 50% of those enslaved. Even if we play conservatively and say that about 25% of those enslaved were Muslims, that means that there were 2.5 million Muslims brought across the sea. And eventually these Muslims would have children, and their children would have children. And this would go on for over 2.5 centuries. So basically, we're probably looking for tens of millions of Muslims in the colonial Americas. So what happened to them? If we're talking about many millions of Muslims living in the Americas, why is there so little evidence of them today? There are a number of reasons. First, as we mentioned above, even though literacy rates were quite high for West Africans in the colonial period, it was rare that enslaved people were given access to reading and writing. So our records are scarce from the get-go. Second, many enslaved people associated their pasts with horror, as one can expect, and so one's life before being kidnapped would probably not be an easy topic of discussion for many people. Third, the enslaved West Africans were moved, separated, and sold without any regard to their tribal or ethnic origins. So, if a newly enslaved person was not surrounded by a sizable number of people who spoke their language, their stories and identities wouldn't survive long after them. Fourth, not all white Europeans and Americans approved of the slave trade, and so part of the justification of the process was the spread of Christianity. Slavery could be explained as a missionary tactic. Therefore, non-Christian religions, and Islam most especially, needed to be stricken from the memories and from history. Fifth, oral historical memory over many generations tends to get quite thin even in the best situation. And so, if an enslaved person in Georgia in 1850 had 1 or 2 Muslim ancestors 200 years before, they probably wouldn't know about it, and they would have no way of looking it up. Sixth, as the institution of slavery became less palatable for white Americans, and then technically illegal following the Civil War from 1861 to 1865, first-hand accounts from witnesses to enslavement tended to thin out in the historical record. White people were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with leaving written evidence that they ever had any connection to slavery. And seventh, and finally, in the case of enslavement, in which people are deliberately and repeatedly taken away from their families, forced into marriages and raped, and therefore have undesired children, family history can very quickly disappear or become obscure, in many cases deliberately. Without any means of tracing your ancestors, the descendants of the enslaved West Africans rarely had any idea where their families were born, or in this instance, what religion they were. In many cases, West African Muslims were simply forced to convert to whatever version of Christianity their so-called owners had, either Protestant or Catholic. This could be done for serious reasons of religion. Many slavers must have genuinely thought that they were spreading civilization and salvation, but more often it was probably a practical move. The slavers and the slave drivers were not unaware that their captives were full human beings, and as such, their docility depended on dehumanizing and demoralizing the West Africans. Using West African names, West African languages, or practicing West African religions like Islam could be a kind of rejection of the power of enslavement, a mental form of escape. Remember that slavery is just one more facet of psychic invasion, enslaving the mind of one's victims, the colonization of self. One Catholic priest, writing in 1668 of enslaved peoples forced to accept Christian baptism in the French Caribbean, said that the West Africans, without the help of the slavers, would have died miserably in the impiety and errors of Muhammad, of which those who are brought from Africa are infected. The slavers and the slave drivers knew what they were doing. Lingering Islam would make their captives less likely to comply with their new situations in the Americas. Having recourse to an ancestral identity like Muslim would open the door for solidarity and communality amongst the enslaved. And as Islam was clearly distinct from Christianity both in the minds of the enslaved and of the enslaver, there was a certain rebellion in keeping Islamic faith and practice alive. Another priest, writing around 1700, even warns against taking Muslims as slaves at all, as they're less likely to accept Christianity than others are. Amongst the enslaved peoples who are not idolaters are those of the Cape Verde, some of which are Muslims. When they are brought in the islands, it is better not to take them, for they never embrace the Christian religion. That said, we must also say that just because a Muslim is forced to convert to Christianity, or adopt a Christian name, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily renouncing their Muslim identities and customs. Since many of the standard practices of Islam, such as the Salat, the daily prayer, the Dua, the supererogatory prayer, the Saum, the fast of Ramadan, and the various kinds of Sufi dhikr can be practiced with few or no other Muslims around, and if necessary, in private, such activities must have continued on. And there are some records of this happening. People in bondage who pray 5 times a day facing a certain direction, or abstained from eating pork, or recited religious formulas, poems, or songs in Arabic. Similarly, those West African Muslims who would have been literate in Arabic, and therefore most certainly would have memorized a great deal of the Quran. This is called a hafiz, literally a guardian, that is, someone who's memorized the entire Quran from cover to cover. This isn't a very rare trick, by the way. Muslims did and still do this all the time, even those who don't speak a word of Arabic personally. Therefore, the absence of written Qurans, or writings in any Islamic languages at all, doesn't necessarily mean that the Quran wasn't present in other ways amongst the enslaved population. There are slave narratives written in Arabic, as well as handwritten Quranic passages that West Africans wrote from memory. For example, an unnamed captive of the South Carolinian David Anderson leaves behind a 2-page manuscript. We don't know this man's name or his story, only that when given the chance to write something down, he wrote this. This is the Quran, Surahs 1, 112, 113, and 114. That is, the surahs of the Quran that can be recited as independent prayers. The man who wrote these probably was not educated or literate in Arabic, but these were some of the Quran's shortest surahs and are therefore the most commonly memorized. What this does tell us, though, is that this unknown, enslaved Muslim thought Islam was so central to who he was that when given the opportunity to write something, anything, he turned to the Quran that he would have learned as a child. Islamic names from Quranic and prophetic sources also give us clues to some of these American Muslims about whom we know little or nothing else. For example, in 1834, a man in Tennessee was seeking funds to travel to Africa. His name was Hamet Abdul, a shortened form of Mahmet or Muhammad. Also using a variant of Muhammad, there was a man named Yarrow Mahmut who lived in Washington, D.C. and died there in 1823. There are also Islamic names that survive in Black American communities but are otherwise unheard of amongst white Americans. These are names like Malik, the Lord, Malika, angel, Latifa, the kind, Jamal, the handsome, Aisha, the lively one of the Prophet's wives, Rashid, the guide, Aliyah, the exalted, Imani, the faithful, or Layla, the knight. Names like these probably survived the slave trade because a white Christian enslaver would not recognize them as distinctly Islamic. What these American Muslims lacked, though, were those Islamic customs and practices that were now, for some reason, impossible. For instance, although the Quran could survive without written literature, other significant Islamic texts could not. We see no evidence of a hadith in the early United States, and neither do we see the presence of Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh. So these American Muslims must have quickly lost any formal Islamic education once the first generations of Africans passed away, and thus there are no American madhabs. And obviously pilgrimages like the Hajj or travel to Sufi maqams was no longer possible. In the British colonies that would become the first United States, forced conversion was slightly more rare at first than elsewhere. This was because the British, who were overwhelmingly Protestant, feared that allowing the captives to convert to Christianity would negate the argument for why these people should be enslaved in the first place. Their supposed heathenism, in this case Islam, justified the need for guidance and the whip of the Christian masters. There were even cases of would-be converts to Protestant Christianity being punished, as this could be seen as an attempt to negate one's own servitude and make oneself equal to one's Christian owner. Although in time, Protestant North Americans would come to embrace conversion as a means of subjugation as well. But this would only happen with the development of American racial theory. As the catch-all categories of blackness, whiteness, Europeanness, and Africanness became the norm, these could be used to explain the institution of slavery without the recourse to religion. How did Islam spread to Western Africa? What are some features of pre-modern West African Islam? Define Marabout. Describe the experience of enslavement and the transatlantic crossing. Explain what we know and what we don't know about Muslims enslaved in America and why. Define Hafez.